Hi everyone, Reinhardt here for cgboost.com, and in this video I will give you a quick breakdown on how I created this Cubic Worlds Campfire scene here. This scene is actually the main scene of the first part of my Cubic Worlds course for Blender. There you will learn every detail on how to create this scene here from scratch, from finding the idea to a final rendered animation with sound and music. That means this video here is not a full tutorial, but rather an overview about how the scene was assembled and what workflows and tools are used. So, enjoy! The whole idea of Cubic Worlds is that every visible object is constructed out of deformed cubes, so no loop cuts, no extrusions, etc., just building scenes as playing with Lego bricks. So in this course we make use of the new asset browser in Blender 3.0, which is currently in the alpha version, and then we drag and drop this super special cube here into the scene, and then by duplicating and deforming it, we can create any asset we can imagine. For more complex assets, we are actually using a different modeling approach here, by building something with a good old-fashioned polygon modeling, and then we convert this into cubes by using an edge split modifier and a solidify modifier. For the smaller elements like the grass and stones in the scene, I used the free object scatter add-on, which is actually shipped with Blender. It just needs to be enabled in the preferences. Then this tool allows us to select one or more objects which we want to scatter, then select the object we want to scatter on, and then simply draw some strokes on the surface and confirm to place the objects. The cool thing is that this actually generates little triangle faces on which the objects are instanced. That means we can simply go into edit mode and duplicate them and move them around and even delete them by just playing around with the triangle faces. With face snapping enabled, we can place the objects everywhere in our scene, which makes it more flexible to work with as using the particle system. Same as for keeping the modeling process simple, we are only using one simple shader that I built to color all the objects in the scene. It is a simple node group where we can adjust a few sliders to change or randomize the color, add an edge or bottom gradient, make it emissive or transparent. And since this shader is applied on the basic cube already, we can build and color our assets at the same time, which makes this a really enjoyable process. Since, as you probably can imagine, we will end up with a lot of cubes in our scene, and here a proper organization is very important to don't go nuts. That's why I make heavy use of collections to group all the related objects in different main and sub collections. This makes it easier to turn certain elements on and off in the scene, or to quickly select a bunch of objects at once. So here you can see these are my main collections. I have a scene helper collection, which basically contains all the objects which are helping with animating the objects and stuff like this. However, they are not visible in the final scene. That's why I mostly turn this off. Then let's disable everything here, and then you can see everything is turned off, and then I can only enable the props, for example, or the particle systems or the characters and stuff like this. Here in the environment collection, for example, you can see we have a bunch of sub collections. So we have the ground, for example, then the robot, and even the robot has additional sub-collections here, which makes it very easy to select certain parts. For example, when I right-click on the hand here, select objects, then you can see the entire hand is selected and I can quick and easily move it around if necessary. Then we have some dunes here, we have some rocks, some trees, and we have the scatter objects, as you can see, which again are organized in sub-collections, so I can even turn single scatter objects on and off. Then in the prop collection you can see we also have a bunch of sub collections where I packed everything which belongs together. So there's a lot going on here in the collection system, and even the particle systems are separated into emitters, force fields for blowing some wind into the smoke. We have a big collision object, as you can see, and we also have the particle objects which are used for the particle systems. So, and sometimes, for example, when you're here working on the ground and you don't always accidentally want to select the ground, we can easily disable selection for the entire ground collection. So I can only select all the other objects. And then as last collection, I have the render collection, which contains everything like the camera, lamp, light blocker objects, and so on and so forth. And of course, organization is not only useful for Cubic Worlds scenes, but for every 3D scene, so I highly recommend to get used to organizing your objects into collections. And by the way, you can create new collections by pressing C. For the particle systems, I use Blender's good old particle system. So let's disable everything here except the particles. Let's also disable the force fields. And here I actually use 4 particle systems. Let's disable them, and then we can see I have one for the fire. Then I have one for the sparks. I have one for the smoke. And I have some dust particles flying around in the scene. And in general, particles are a great way to add more life to your scene. And here I don't want to go into all the details because what I'm using here is actually quite simple. When I quickly have a look at the particle system, we have a typical emission particle system with a certain velocity, and as render objects we are using some objects which I packed into the particle object collection. So these objects here are used for all the particle systems. Here, for example, this is the one for the fire, the one for the sparks, here the one for the smoke, and again here I'm just using the same Cubic Worlds shader as I use for all the other objects, and then I just connect these objects here with the particle system. And one important thing I used here to make the particles fade out over the time or change the size over time so they don't just disappear. And this we can do here in the texture settings. Just create a new texture, go to the texture settings, change the mapping to strand particle and the influence enable size, and then using the color ramp down here we can adjust how the particles will change the size. This will be defined from left to right as if this here is a timeline, and everything black means the particles are scaled to 0 and everything white means they are scaled up to 1. So they are scaled up to 1 in a short amount of time, and then over time they are scaled down to 0. So then we have this nice effect that they are appearing and disappearing over time, and the same I applied to the smoke and the sparks as well. For the dust particles, I just used some physics settings here. I enabled the Brownian value and basically disabled the entire velocity here. And I set the emission to a negative value. That means as soon as the scene starts here at the beginning, the particles are there. And here I created a big collision object where I enabled the collision in the physics tab so that the particles will stay inside this boundary and don't flow away, because then at some point there are no particles left in the scene because they are all flying away. But here they are just bouncing off the collision object and then they stay in the scene. Yeah, and with a simple force field here I was able to make the smoke blow into a certain direction, and here I could even increase the strength, as you can see. Then we have a very strong wind. Well, and look at this, the smoke is bouncing around in this collision shape. Looks super cool actually. Let's talk about animation. When I play back the animation, you can see that a lot of things are moving in the scene, and most of this is actually not hand animated, because here I used a lot of procedural animation techniques. All in all, the particle systems of course adds a lot of motion to the scene, but when I turn this off, you can see that there's still a lot of objects moving around. By the way, we will discuss the pop-up animation which happens at the start and at the end of the scene in a later section of this video. Here let's just discuss the general movement of some of these objects. And by the way, about the camera animation I will also talk about later in this video. First of all, when I zoom in here and disable the render collection, we can see that we have a bit of random movement. The grass is moving, the vines are moving here, the cables, and also here the pot, the tent, and this character. Let's go to the animation workspace and let's have a look at the character and this pot here first, because all I did was adding one keyframe for one rotation axis, as you can see. And then here in the graph editor, when I press N, go to modifiers, I added the noise modifier. And this will add this random noise to the animation curve. And then you can see this pot is moving around randomly on the x-axis here. And you can play around with these values here of the noise modifier to make this stronger and faster or slower. Well, this is very strong wind right now. The same technique I used for the cables here. Here I added some shape keys, and this shape key here, as you can see, it's doing this very simple wiggle animation. And on this value here, I also applied the noise modifier, and then the cable is doing some random movements in the wind. So it's just randomly changing the shape key value over here. Then for the character, by the way, the character is a pre-made character which we added here to the scene, which I provide in the course. However, in the second part of the course, which I will add a bit later, we will also learn how to create characters, robots and machines from scratch and how to rig and animate them. And here I used the same technique. I switched over to pose mode, select a bunch of these bones here, and then I added a simple keyframe for the rotation and added the noise modifier, and then the character is also randomly moving around. Then I turned the animation of the character into an action here in the nonlinear animation editor, which we can find over here. And here we can also open up the sidebar, go to modifiers and add some modifiers, and here I added the stepped modifier and changed the step size to 6, and then the character is moving as in stop motion movies, which I found to be a very cool effect for the characters. Yeah, and for the grass and for the vines I used a different technique, because these are the objects which I scattered in the scene using the object scatter add-on. And as you maybe remember, here we have a lot of small triangles, and what I did here, I added a displacement modifier, which basically changes the position of the faces a bit, since here I added a simple clouds texture, which makes the faces move up and down. If I increase the strength here, you can see what's happening. And then in my scene helpers collection, I added a simple empty object, and by adding a simple driver here, simply type in hash frame and then times whatever you like. And then this object is moving with each frame of the animation in a certain direction, in this case the X direction, as you can see. And then I simply connected this empty object here to the displace modifier, so the texture of the displace modifier is moving, and in this way the grass is moving in the wind all the time, as you can see. And the same I applied to the veins up here, and also to the tent. So everything is moving as if the wind is blowing. So, and now let's have a look on how I created this pop-up animation here at the start. And this also happens here at the end. So to quickly show you this, I added a bunch of objects from the asset library which is shipped with the course. And first of all, this is important, you need to select everything, press Ctrl A and apply the scale for all the objects here in order to make this work. Then we need an object which is animated already. Here I have this cube which I animated. It's a very simple animation where I only animated the scale of the object, so it's popping up. And this will be our reference object. Then you find a link in the video description to the free Commotion add-on, which you can download. Then all you need to do is to select all the objects which you want to have animated, and as last object, the one which is animated already. Then you go to Animation Utils and click on Copy. Now we are copying the animation from this object to all the other objects. And since I only animated the scale, the position and rotation of the object is not changing at all. But you can see all of them are now popping up. And now we can place our 3D cursor in any position, for example over here, with Shift right click, and then we can offset the animation by the cursor. Let's click on Offset Animation, and then you can see that these objects are popping up. And we can also increase the offset if we like, then click on Offset Animation, but let's go to the first frame, click on Offset Animation, and then all these objects are popping up. Yeah, and this easy you can make your objects pop up in your scene, which is not complicated at all, as you can see. Now let's have a look at the camera setup. Here let's go over to the rendered viewport shading, and as you can see when I go into the camera view, that this scene, even here in the viewport, looks fantastic already, and that's because in this course we will learn how to render the scene with Eevee and cycles with very similar results. And there we also go over how to optimize the render quality and the render speed. So however, here I don't want to go deep into the render settings. First let's have a look at the camera setup. Let's enable the overlays here, and first of all let's have a look at the camera animation. Here we can see the camera, and this camera is actually parented to an empty object, which we can see over here. When I press R and lock this along the Z-axis, you can see that we can rotate the camera here. So I just animated this empty object to make this rotation movement. And then down here I selected the keyframes, pressed T and set the keyframe interpolation to linear. That means the animation speed is the same for the entire animation, so the camera is always moving with the same speed. In terms of resolution and so on, let's go to the output settings here, dimensions. I used a 21:9 aspect ratio in 4K, and I have set the frame rate to 60 frames per second to have a super smooth playback in the animation later on. The camera itself is set to an orthographic view here under lens. You can see it under type, because I wanted to have this kind of isometric look. That means if I switch back to perspective, we have this more realistic look, which looks also pretty cool in general, but this low poly style fits very nicely with this orthographic isometric view. And then we can change this orthographic scale to zoom in or out depending on how big your scene is. Then as you can see, I also enabled depth of field here to get this shallow depth of field effect. And since the whole scene looks like a miniature, we can go pretty crazy with this depth of field effect, which will fit very nicely here. Of course, don't overdo it, but it works really nice. And here I used a simple empty object, which I placed here, which I connected with the focus point. So I can select this empty, move this around in the scene to change the focus, as you can see. Then let's talk about the light setup. When I disable the light here, you can see we still have this bluish ambient light, which is generated from the world background. Here you can see I have this blue color with a very low strength. If I set this to 0, everything is just black. Then let's enable the lights and let's disable the moonlight. First of all, I have this point lamp, which I placed on top of the fire here. And here I added also the noise modifier in the graph editor to make this lamp wiggle around randomly, which makes the shadow around the fire move randomly, which looks very nice in the final animation. And this is just an orange point lamp with pretty strong power. Then as a contrast to this orangey color, I added the moonlight, which is a blue sunlight with pretty strong intensity. And to make this look even cooler, I added some light blockers, because by default, the scene would look something like this. And as you can see, this is lacking focus. The whole background is pretty bright and is also grabbing our attention. And that's why I added some light blockers, which basically let only light into the main area of the scene here, which gives us a very nice focus. And this I achieved by simply adding some cubes over here, which are adding the shadow at the bottom. And these we can move around freely to decide where the shadow should appear on the ground. And I also added a cube here where I added a simple principal volume shader to also have a little bit of volumetric fog in the scene. When I turn this off, you can see the difference. Then to make the scene look a bit cooler, in the render settings, I enabled ambient occlusion, which adds this darkening shadow in all the corners and creases. Here I increased the distance quite a lot and also the factor. And I also enabled bloom, which adds this nice glow effect on top of glowing elements. As final touch, I added the medium-high contrast here under color management. When I turn this off, you can see the image has less contrast. So let's go back here. And I also increased the exposure a bit to make the image pop a bit more. Yeah, and in the end, I rendered out the whole animation as a PNG image sequence. So you will render out single images for each frame of the animation. And this is always recommended because when your computer crashes, you don't lose any render information, or when you have some errors in single frames of the animation, you can simply replace them. Yeah, and then to finalize the whole animation, I sent this project over to my colleague Richard Albert, who is a composer and sound designer, and he composed some music and added some sound effects. And the final sound editing he did actually in Blender. As you can see here, when I play back the animation, we have all these pop-up sounds. Also back here. And some ambient sounds here at the center to really add life to the scene. And in the Cubic Worlds course, you will also learn how to fully do this here with free sound effects you can find online. But yeah, this would go too far to dive deeper into this section here. But as you can see, all that can be done directly in Blender. Yeah, in this video we just scratched the surface on what is possible with the Cubic Worlds workflows and style. If you find this video inspiring and want to dive deeper into the Cubic Worlds and want to learn how to create your own scenes, check out the course over at academy.cgboost.com. Besides creating these Cubic Worlds scenes, I will soon also add more content to the course where we will also discuss character, machine and robot creation, rigging and animation in the Cubic Worlds style. Yeah. See you inside the course or in one of my next videos. Goodbye.